Welcome to Conversations at Rethink Education with Gretchen Wegner
and Susanna Cole. You are in for a treat today. We are having a conversation with Sophie Christophy all about consent-based education. We take a deep dive, and it is juicy, into relationships, parent and children, teachers and student, power versus consent. You do not want to miss this.
so many really rich takeaways for both Susanna and I, and even Sophie. So if you need to know more about who she is, we're not going to do a long intro here. Links are below. And really, I just want to get to the good stuff. So let's dig in.
Have you both come out of mainstream education originally, or did you start working like one-to-one?
Let's do a little history. Let's do that. And then maybe you can do a little history too, and then we'll go in. Susanna, you want to start?
Yeah, I'll start because yes, I came from 25, well, I've classroom teacher of varying degrees. So I was a college professor for several years, teaching early childhood. And then I went into teaching learning support, working one-on-one with students with learning differences. And then I was a middle school teacher. Within that time frame, I was also a learning consultant doing educational testing, psychoeducational testing with students. So I've had little pieces of all traditional classrooms. Slightly, I started it with a new school as the middle school teacher, the head of middle school. So that was a whole experiment in education. So I've done a little bit of everything, but a lot in the traditional system for sure.
Okay.
And now for the last 6 years, I've been an executive function coach, working with students one-on-one, mostly high school and college level students around the habits and mindsets and strategies for learning how to learn.
So still working with young people who are in traditional school environments.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so that's very interesting for us to wrap back around to by the end, right? Because we're kind of stuck. In some ways, you could see it as stuck. There's whatever schooling system the student is in, that's what we're helping them learn to tolerate minimally and potentially thrive inside. There's the parent who has paid us. So there is the tension of the parents' expectations and their own understanding about parenting. And then we bring in whatever we bring in about our ability to stay super student-centered or whatever. And I train educators now how to become coaches. So I'm very interested in how do we help educators start glimpsing the image that just came to me is of like water over the head and like just,
yeah,
it would be great to like come all the way out of the water, but really just see, oh, this is the water I'm swimming in. Just
are you that. Sorry, Gretchen, are you then kind of like taking this idea that coaching as a modality for tutoring, is that the idea that like it's a different dynamic, and so like maybe if educators were in more of a coaching dynamic, that would be better than like the power
sort of. There is that there. And actually, let me say, so my history is I spent all of my 20s doing weird things in education. I was performing as an actor educator at a theater company, and we would go in and do like 8 half-hour sessions with different students on topics like respect and responsibility and whatever else. And then I thought, I just want to be a classroom teacher. I want relationships with students. So I went back to school, became a classroom teacher, was a classroom teacher in a very cushy situation where my largest class was 16 students, smallest class was 8. And even then I was like, where are the relationships that I was looking for? And we're not talking about anything meaningful. And the students are saying they don't want to do homework. And I'm like, I don't want to grade your homework. But here we are stuck in a constraint. And how do we find possibility within that constraint? And I was too scared to quit. And I was struggling. I needed some really strong mentoring for how to do that. And I didn't get that mentoring. And then I was invited to quit at the end of the contract and not come back. And that's when I accidentally found my way into academic coaching. And not from a place of this is the better way, but it's a place of, it's a growing movement because the schools are not meeting students' skill needs. And there's a story, we may talk a little later about the lies we tell students, right? One of those lies is that you need to get certain grades and get into college in order to have a successful life. And parents are feeling the fear around that and are willing to put money into coaching. And so we're skills coaches rather than tutors. And so, like Susanna used the phrase executive function coach, I use the phrase academic coach, but regardless, we're looking at what are the skills to help students better be able to handle their lives and also their learning, and how can they feel some amount of understanding and ownership about who they are, and bring that to the table.
And interestingly, you said that because I'm Sophie, I'm actually creating a course right now called Teachers as Coaches, because I do feel like one of those incremental small steps that we could make is for teachers to incorporate a coaching skill set into their daily practices. And that is a way to introduce consent into the classroom, and lots of other great principles that currently a teaching skill set doesn't really allow for, but it could absolutely be possible.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Cool. Okay.
So, and here, hopefully, if we decide to use this in the final video, the listeners are like, now, who is this woman they've invited into this conversation? So maybe introduce yourself the way we just introduced ourselves quickly, but letting us know whatever your history is and then where you are now.
Oh, wow. It's a tricky one, isn't it? Sometimes I'm out on the street and we'll get chatting to a neighbor or someone and they're like, oh, so what do you do? And I'm always like, oh no, like, welcome to the rabbit hole. You know, yeah. So, I mean, what do I do? I don't know. I'm started off probably as a mum, seeing my own kids and just knowing that like just couldn't put them into the squish of school and everything else, and just wanting them to be able to grow as themselves and in the best way that they could. And I couldn't see how that just fitted with almost anything around us that's for kids. It's like, oh gosh, you know. And my background is that I'm like third generation education interested person on both of my like parents' sides. My grandfather was a head teacher, my mum was a teacher, my dad is a teacher, my ex-husband is a secondary school teacher, my partner is in academics. Like, you know, it's all over the place, which I think is helpful because it's really demystified that whole world. You were saying before about the stories that parents hear, and for me those stories have been really busted because of my relationship to the system through people and myself, I suppose. But yeah, what I do now is I run communities that are nothing like school, but where a lot of rich learning, relationship and community occur, that are based on principles of self-direction and consensuality and ed positivity, we call it, which is basically a very broad, curious and open-minded approach to what you might want to learn about or do with your time, as long as it's not hurting you or anyone else. It's very broad. I'm an unschooler. My kids have never been to school. They come to these settings. I also work with other people that are setting up places like this, and parents and other folk who want to transition in a way from like paradigm A, which maybe is like the traditional school and traditional model for childhood, to paradigm B, as I call it, which is one that's based more on consent, more on the whole person, more on growing as we're meant to grow, in my opinion. So yeah, so I help people get from that one to that one.
And you have a course for any, I was about to use the word grown-ups, I don't even know if that's the right word. people who may want to learn more about your framework that we'll talk more about as we move forward.
Yeah, we have like a bunch of different ways to learn with this stuff. So like I've been running a cycle of courses now since 2017. And then we also do like really practice specific stuff. So about how to run a meeting in this way where power is shared amongst the community. So like young children are chairing that meeting, and we do about how to navigate conflict and how to manage risk in this way where it's shared. Yeah.
I just want to name, when you're saying young children, because I just heard you say this in the other podcast, you mean like a 5-year-old can run a meeting for an entire community.
Yeah, including the adults that are working in that place. So up to like our maximum meeting will be 15 people of mixed ages. Yeah.
Yeah. It's remarkable. I hope people who
Yeah.
are listening just try and imagine that.
I
And
know.
notice what limitations come up when you're trying to imagine that. Sorry, go ahead.
I think it's that thing, isn't it? One part of what I do in my work is to really walk up to the limiting beliefs that people hold around the capacity of young people. You know, I think in the mainstream system, though, it's kind of set up to make children look less capable than they are. It's always asking them for a little bit more than what they can do and creating that power differential between the adult teacher and the young person, rather than looking at what they are really able at doing and valuing those things at that age, if you see what I mean. So it creates this dynamic where like the adults are smarter, faster, better at everything, and the children are like less. You know, and then therefore, who do you delegate responsibility to? You always give it to the adult because you think that they're better at everything, and the children think that too. Whereas in our settings, we don't do that. And so actually what you end up seeing is a really interesting range of capacities, interests, and abilities that fly in the face of what many people believe children want to do, are able of doing, because they're held by this culture that really affirms them in their wherever they're at, you know, but honors it in a different way. So yeah, it's really interesting.
Suzanne, I'm aware, I feel like I'm dominating right now, but I have one more thing that I want to say on this regard. Is that okay?
Please, please.
Because I had this practice when I was taking notes when I was listening to you, and I noticed I was doing it now. You are using the language of adult and child. And I have recently been working inside a medical school of higher education. And everything, like you just said, could be true if you inserted the word teacher and student, regardless of the age of the person. That when we jump in, there's something about schooling that the minute we have that frame, there is, and this is big language, I'm going to use it now because I heard you using it before. I know people are triggered by it, but we automatically go into some version of dominance and submission, and we can't stop ourselves. And I can't stop myself. And we'll talk today about ways in which I think we've maybe all caught ourselves in that frame. And it's striking to me that we do it and justify it in educational settings for adults. Whereas you said those very behaviors might even be considered unlawful if they were happening inside adult romantic relationships. Yet we justify it for children and we justify it for students.
Yeah, it's part of patriarchy that is then translated into institutions, because when you build an institution, you do it through a lens, right? You do it through like a sense of the world. And when like in that system, what's super interesting, and like you were saying about why do people fall into it, like why do I suddenly like become this submissive person if in another context I might be quite assertive, or you know, just in this specific learning relationship or whatever. And I think it's largely to do with safety. If you're in an environment where someone has power over you to determine your grade, your presence in that room, if you're good or bad, then your system kicks in self-protection to fawn to them. It's like a flight, freeze, fawn response, right? It's like, I need to be close to this person in a way that is going to keep me safe. And so the way to do that is to submit like straight away. Yeah, because you know you don't have equal power to them. You cannot challenge them in the way that they can challenge you. You don't have, like, in real terms, the ability to do that. And so what are you going to do to survive? Right. And it's like, that's just the institutional culture. And I think even within the teaching faculty, you see it on a hierarchical level. You know, still a classroom teacher may fawn to their head of department, may fawn to their head teacher, may not challenge something that isn't okay, may not ask for what they need, because they are also within it. Goes like as far as you want. Whatever room you're in, you're going to see it if that's the culture overall.
Yeah.
So in order to not do that, you have to feel safe.
Mhm.
You have to not feel like you need to approximate yourself to the person in power to be safe. So you need to know that you are just safe all the time. And then you won't move into that submissive dynamic.
Mhm.
It's intense. There was so much, and oh yeah, so many places even just that simple thought could take us. Oh boy.
Mhm.
Yeah.
We went in at the deep end.
We did. We did. We did.
Straight
This is
in.
how we like to do it. This is how Gretchen and I roll.
Well, and I love that we're on video so we could see the faces, your face, like, and our face. So, Susanna, do you think we should move into the story that I was going to tell, or do you think we should go to a
Yes.
different place?
No, I actually think that's a perfect transition. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. We tried to be prepared, Sophie, but not too prepared.
Nice.
So, I was at an event years ago now, a pre-pandemic event that was at a middle school and a girls' middle school. And we were talking to an expert on girls and sociology. And consent was a part of the conversation, and parents were there. And of course, this consent was around sexuality, as it, I think the most common space for that framing is around make sure you ask for consent before you do X, Y, and Z to someone. And I think the assumption often when we hear that is the boy asks it of the girl. So already we're in the gender and sexuality binary, and already we're in the boy to girl process. And a father raised his hand and said, I don't like the word consent. Because it's like we're training my daughter to be the passive recipient and for boys to get to say, this is what I want. And she says yes or no. But where is she the active co-creator? Someone with desire meeting somebody else's desire and making things together, having a wonderful, safe experience together. And I love that because I teach something I may share later that I call the consent burger. And so I also think about consent, but I love this idea. And I thought maybe we would start with that story because I'd love to hear how you might define consent inside schooling, because I'm making an assumption that may or may not be true, and you can say that likely your definition of consent has more to do with co-creation than it does with a one-way active and passive transaction.
Definitely, for sure. I mean, I think that, yeah, it's interesting, the story that you shared, because it doesn't, I feel like it's maybe specific to whatever had just been taught in that place, because for me that isn't what consent means, as it, like, it's not passive and active in one way. It may be at times that there is one person asking another person, like, if they want to do something or make something or go somewhere, or, you know, because for me consent is a like lifestyle, not just about sex and sexuality and bodies, you know, being sexual together or whatever. But so yeah, I think yeah, I suppose what I was thinking was, well, sometimes it might be one person is active and the other is like more receiving, but then it could easily switch, and then the other person is the active one saying something and to the other, but then it could be two people who are checking it out and there's a shared energy around it. Like, it doesn't have to be just one way. Of course not. You know, for me, consent is literally about that a person gets to have information about what it is that is going to happen to them or that they're going to do, and they get to make a choice, a free choice, so not coerced, to say yes, no, or maybe I need to think about it. That's it. And for us, that work at the settings that I work in, it works on many levels. Well, 5 that we really think about. So one is your body, like what happens to your body that you should get to know that and be able to say yes, no, or maybe around your body. That it works on an emotional level, also on an intellectual level, on a spiritual level, and on a creative level. And that these are the sort of 5 different areas that, you know, you might notice when it comes to consent and personal boundaries, or, self-awareness of what you like or don't like, kind of coming into and out of those different parts of yourself in a way. And obviously, like, the body is easier to talk about because it's tangible. We can like see if I'm touching myself or someone else, like not like that, but like in whatever it is, bodies are easy to see. But it's not easy to see someone's spirituality always. It's not easy to see someone's intellectual experience or their emotional. I mean, emotional maybe you can see sometimes in people's expression, but not always. So it does require like a conversation or yeah. But anyway, I suppose that to me is maybe why sometimes the consent conversation comes down to bodies, because it's just the most clearly defined way to talk about it. Yeah.
But your definition of consent-based education, like if there was the least people needed to know about what this is, how would you respond to that?
Okay, let me think. The least version of it is that just fundamentally people should be able to decide what it is they do, what they want to learn about, when and how, that they should be able to say yes, no, now, maybe later to those things. That's the basic, that there should be some agency and autonomy in that. The slightly expanded version is that consent is the ethical counterbalance to self-direction. And I don't know whether like you or your listeners have heard about self-directed education. It's like kind of like the more well-known, that instead of traditional schooling, you want self-direction instead. But self-direction with no limit isn't better than, it's still another form of misuse of power, in my opinion. If you're just self-directing all over everyone, doesn't matter what anyone else is feeling, you just do what you want to do, then that's not great either, right? You've just kind of fragmented the problem like into individuals. So for me, consent is where that has an ethical counterbalance. It's like I get to be self-directed so long as it's consensual to the other people when my self-direction hits theirs. So that, do you see what I mean? So that's kind of like bringing that side in as well, because you can't have one without the other, right? Consent comes from a place inside of yourself, that knowing or awareness of what is okay for me or not, which we really try to help people like find what is true for them, not what they think or what they're scared about. Like, oh no, if I could, I would paint my nails this color, but I'm worried what people will say, so I'm not going to do it. That's not consent-based self-direction to me. It's like a response to stigma or fear. So part of consent, you need to be self-connected. You need to be able to say what is true for you, like know yourself and know what you actually want to do, and be willing to say that out loud.
I love that connection that you're making, because I actually just created a being authentic how-to guide, and as you were speaking, I was just like, oh my gosh, because being true to yourself is that's like the starting place. And I hadn't really made that direct connection, but it's so true that if we build our own understanding of what's true for us and our own, being authentic is something that you practice daily. It's not, you don't arrive at being authentic, but you're doing that. And as you do that, it's so that you can have more say in your life and be clear about yes, no, maybe. If we do not know who we are, we can't possibly then be clear and know that we're saying what we really mean and what is right for us. So I love that connection between those two.
And in a coaching dynamic, I'm often finding myself asking a student a question. They'll answer the question, and then I'm like, I just need to check in. Are you saying that because you feel like you should say that because I'm the grown-up here, or I have some power here? Or are you saying that because that's truly what you want, or don't you know? And wherever you are, it's fine, but let's explore that. And I feel like that's something we just have to do as educators these days if we're trying to bring in ethics into our dynamic with students, given how they've been trained out of their authentic self.
I think for parents too, that the thing around when parents come to you and they have a sense of what they want from you or what they need from you or the problem they're trying to solve in like working with you. Well, where is that coming from in them? Is that true for them, or is this also part of like what they think they should be doing as a parent, what they have been told that they need to do? I don't think it. I mean, for me, that is not how it's felt. I found myself in conflict with that story every single day as a parent. What I feel is right for my children to be able to be themselves, to be authentic, to live a life of integrity, you know, to be in the world like living fully, like is challenged all the time by the narrative of childhood, young people, schooling, all the rest of it, which literally like smushes it out the door, you know. So probably for the parents as well, it's a good question. You know, do you want me to do this, or do you want us to do this because you really believe this is true? Like, you really think this is the case? Or, you know, it's interesting, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It is, and it makes me think of the one of the questions I really wanted to ask you, Sophie, because for me, I was so intrigued listening to the Rethinking Education interview you had, and I noticed myself, like I pride myself on being an educator who cares very much about centering students, and that, you know, my biggest goal is to increase the humanness that we have in school. And so I listened, and there was these moments where I was quite triggered because I realized, like when you were talking about schooling being violent, for example, I was like, oh my God, if I think about some of the interactions that I've had with students over my whole career as an educator, you know, there's a ton of forgiveness that would have to occur for me to be able to, you know, reconcile some of the choices I made, even though I have always been a teacher who wanted students to have the most genuine experiences and have choice. And I wanted them to feel seen and heard in the classroom. And I still, at the end of the day, I was still the authority in the classroom. And I still made sure, like when you were talking about, you know, how consent for students in school, no matter what we say about consent, their experience is there is no place to say no. And I was like, oh my God, I never, you know, students, yeah, there was no place that they could say no. And if they said no, then it just went up another level in the hierarchy until they eventually had to acquiesce to something, because it was no place for them to say no in that classroom or in that school environment. And then when you talked about the, you know, the lies that we tell students, I was like, oh my God, even as a coach, I still do this because I want buy-in from my students. I'm like, so why do you want to work on this history assignment? I mean, they don't want to work. They don't want to study for this test. And so I tell the lie that this is going to matter one day so that you can get into the school you want to go to, so that you can become the person that you want to become. I do it all the time. And then, so when you were talking about, you know, that's a lie. It's like, oh God. Yeah. So there's no question in there, except can you just say more about oh yeah.
I mean,
that.
I think the thing that I feel like saying is that I often will share about this issue, and like it's very rare that an educator will respond to me in the way you just have. That's really not common, that someone will be able to observe their part in something and appreciate that and acknowledge that it's an issue, right? Normally it will be kind of like, yeah, like minimize, or, you know, just let's move on. There'll be a resistance, a grief curve reaction of like, blah, you know, it's just like, it's like glitch, like, can we do something else, you know? So it's actually really moving for me to hear you say that. And it very much makes me want to say to you, like, all forgiveness that you want and need should be here for you. That's how I feel. Because the thing is, like, this is a humongous problem. It's so embedded. The thing that you are talking about is like at scale, right? It's massive. And breaking out of it is very difficult. By its nature, it, you know, for me, I've said before, like, oh, if someone says, oh, what's the one thing that you would do to change the education system that you think would be most transformative? And my response at the moment is I would ban coercive control in schools. Because if you did that, if you no longer could control the behavior of everyone in there through coercion, which basically means threatening that something bad is going to happen to you if you do X, not like physically punished, but like you will fail in your life. You will not be able to, the same things that in like we were saying earlier on, or there's a mention of like in romantic relationships, if someone says to you, oh, if you wear that thing or you behave that way or you do that, then you're this kind of person or that kind of person. That you can't, that's abuse. But if we stopped coercive control as a behavior management tool in schools, it would cause a process of transformation towards something more consensual, because consent is what comes out at the end of removing these controlling strategies. You end up in a place of where that person gets to say what they want to do, who they are, and express themselves and make choices, right, without being afraid. So I think, but I mean, and the fact that it's such a key and a cornerstone and so pivotal in that transformative process is also helps you to understand like why it's so difficult to do it, because it's so fundamental to everything. Like compelling someone to do something or do a project or learn something that they don't want to do. Like, how do you do that without a threat? Because there isn't a good reason. Right? There literally isn't a good reason. There's so many valuable things people can do with their time beyond that one specific thing that's been identified. Like, there really often is not a valid argument. And then it comes back to the like dependency really on these stories, like we said, or the lies that are told, So anyway, I guess, yeah, I just think it's really brilliant that you are thinking about that, and what trying to maybe work out like how could it be not like that for you, because I think it's one of those things like it's hard to unsee it once you've seen it. It's hard to say the words, like you'll say them and it'll be like blah, blah, like marbles falling out of your mouth and like skittering around the floor, because you're like, I know it's not quite true, it's hard. So like you have to in a way now think, okay, so what next? Like, what next if I don't want to do that? If I don't want the marble thing?
And it's interesting, I think ever since hearing your interview, that has been what's been happening. Like there is this disconnect in my brain every time I'm trying to convince a student that there's something good they should be doing. And I'm like, oh, and also like you're saying, thinking about what else could I say in this moment? How can I connect with this person in a different way so that it is more relational as opposed to that transactional, that if you do this now, then that will happen in the future. And in that idea of not always talking about the future, because that was always my go-to. It's like, can I look at different ways to get into this relationship with a student without talking about the future?
Yeah. I think also like when you're cleaning up this stuff, one of the really important parts of the cleanup process is naming the things, or like speaking about them without speaking from them, if that makes sense. So I think an example, that came to me while you were talking just now would be like, okay, look, basically it's a means to an end, isn't it? To talk about it honestly, if you do want to do this thing, and I'm not saying you have to or should do, there's loads of things you could do, but if you want to do this thing, this is a means to that end. And I will help you do that if that is what you want to do, because I get it, it's hard, but if that's what you want, then fine. But what you need to know is that there are alternatives should you wish to explore them, but they're not for everyone. You need to think about it. So that, do you see what I mean? It's shifting it from you're always trying to like open a door crack. It's because people get locked mentally inside the paradigm of it, right? Inside the system. They don't see anything else as valid. They believe and internalize that if they do not do this, like a really terrible thing is going to happen on like some sort of like cellular level. It's like a conveyor belt, isn't it? Like up to are you going to make it or not? And it's like, you could just walk off it if you want. Like there isn't a big drop. You could just walk off. But do you see what I mean? So some of this is about just creating chinks of awareness around like, oh, I met someone the other day, like they've never even been to school. Like, isn't that so interesting? Not everyone does their learning in school. I wonder what that's like. Just anything that mixes it up a bit and brings a bit of awareness of things other than this like tunnel vision, I think is helpful.
Tunnel vision that's rooted in fear. Yeah.
Well, Well, and so what's running in my head right now is I told you I'm working at a medical school. And so I'm immersed in an institutional environment for the first time in a long time. I've been outside of school institutions for 15 years until now. And it's not just a school, but it's medical school. And there's the argument, we like patients' lives are at stake here.
Wow.
Depending, like you have to learn this well. And if you don't do it X, Y, and Z, and this is why we're grading in these high stakes ways, because we've got to protect the patients. And that's, on the one hand, I get that. I mean, yeah, I'm about to have a major surgery. My jaw
on
is
the
being,
other side, okay?
say that again.
We want you on the other side of that.
Yeah.
They better know what they're doing.
They better know what they're doing. Exactly. And medical education also has inherited, just like other forms of education and other institutions, a long history of hierarchy that's directly from patriarchy, right?
Yeah.
Directly the structure of this doctor, this teacher is more important, has more power, can even treat sub people underneath him. I'll say him because that's the history, in certain ways that might actually look abusive, but it's okay because it's in service. So I've been thinking about, yeah, go ahead.
You know what's interesting about this, right? Because medicine and sex are the two places where consent is like the most earliest conversations have occurred, because they're the extremes. Yeah, like the consequence of non-consensual sex is rape. It's illegal. It's very bad, right? Like, so that's a hot spot for that conversation and awareness. Like, what happens when the worst thing can happen occurs, right? And there's language for it, and people generally know that isn't okay. And then in medicine, you also have the same, but it's because of, like you say, the life and death aspect. So there's a high stakes which requires there to be this question around patient consent. Most early like consent work and consent like legislation and policy came out of the medical world. It's kind of like the earliest space where patient consent has been meaningful or even a thing and an awareness, you know, because for this reason of the intensity of the experiences that happen in medicine, mean that people care about it, like it's a thing, right? But I think like what you're saying is that you can have this notion of consent being important, that actually the patient's consent matters within a culture where also it doesn't at all. It's like you said, because the actual culture, traditional culture of medicine is deeply patriarchal, you know, that doctors are like gods, right? Like that, which is how patriarchy also is. That's the top of the hierarchy. The father is like God, the king is like God. It's all, you know, there's this divine right to rule over everything else and be like kind of unaccountable. So that plays out also in medical spaces, in that, you know, the hierarchy of that. So although theoretically consent is a requirement, the person's experience of their own giving of consent is often completely like diminished by that fearfulness or sense of not knowing, like, oh, I'm only a patient, I couldn't possibly know what I want to do. I always gonna lean to what the doctor says. Like
we're just signing a form. Yes, I acknowledge I've been told.
Yeah, exactly. It's reduced to that. It's like, oh yeah, they told me I might die, maybe 10% chance, I'll sign on the line. Okay, like that's not consent. Like that's the weirdest thing ever. That's just like, I read the form, you know. But so yeah, it's super interesting as a place to think about these things. And like you said, like the way in which, you know, I mean, we could have another whole podcast around like quality versus quantity of life and medicine and all of that, like what goes on in that place, because it's super interesting, isn't it? Just like with education, I think there's a evolution in values around that. People are maybe thinking and feeling differently about life and death and health and all of these things and engagement with the medical system. But we're here to talk about education, but it's connected.
Everything's connected, just like you've said, and I also believe, and I know Susanna does too, there's not such a thing as science versus history versus English versus Spanish versus whatever. And yet that's how we have structured knowledge, because we've inherited it from, we've been using the word patriarchy. And I wish there was another word that also encapsulated white supremacy and colonialism, because it's all part of the same soup.
Yeah.
And I don't know what the word would be, but
there's a great quote from Bell Hooks that wraps it all up. White, supremacist, patriarchal. Oh God, I wish I could remember it, but I want to credit Bell Hooks because yeah, she did summarize it into a lovely quote. And because yeah, it's a complex issue, isn't it? That with all these things that come together, like you said, it's artificial to separate them out.
Well, I'm aware that we could go in all kinds of different directions, and I'm aware that time is limited. We don't need this to be a 8-hour podcast. You have a night to go into. But I think maybe I'm thinking, Susanna, next step, maybe let's get concrete with some specific actionable strategies. How do you feel about that?
Yes.
And maybe the way into that is for me to tell you a little bit about my consent burger model and to get your feedback about that, or just anything that comes up for you around that. Because what I'm looking for, I mean, most people listening to us or out there are not going to dive in and adopt the model that you have with the students who you work with. And I forget if we said, but there is a quote unquote school that's not a school, where students spend time in community and the 5-year-olds sometimes lead the meetings. As beautiful as that is, most people are likely not going to adopt that. And so I'm very interested in how do we scale back and look at those cracks? Like, where can we find people who are willing, who see, oh, there might be a different way. How can we start experimenting with it and letting it be okay that the larger context is coercive? Even more of my behaviors may be coercive, but here's this one little area I can play with an alternative to coercion. And for me, in the consent burger, it's the idea of, there's a top bun and a bottom bun. And this is how, rather than just teach kids things, how do you top bun is setting the context, like, oh, I heard that you're curious about, or you need X, Y, and Z. I have a potential solution or something that might be interesting and helpful for you around that. Would you be willing for me to spend 10 minutes teaching you a little something to see if it would be helpful? And then the student can say yes or no. This is in one-to-one coaching context. And then the burger is the teaching itself, one of many of my anti-boring mini lectures, I call them, but it can be anything in there. And then the bottom burger is like, okay, that was the thing I wanted to teach you. Was it relevant? What part was relevant? What are you thinking? It's not about me anymore. It's about you. Talk to me. And just making sure that we always contextualize. Anyway, I saw you, Susanna, you peeped.
I was just going to say, and this concept when I met Gretchen was what really transformed my coaching. So this was what started me really realizing the difference that consent can make, because the shift in students, when you even just ask them, is this something you're interested in learning more about? Like, and then of course, exploring all the different ways and what that can sound like in a relationship with someone. So it was just, I just wanted to mention that it really, truly was for me transformational in how I work with students, and now continue to explore and want to be better at making space for all of students to bring all of themselves to the coaching session, and what that looks like.
Yeah, it's super interesting. So can I try and like summarize it back to you, what I think I heard?
Yeah.
So I think what I heard is that the top bun is almost the asking, it's the question or the posing of the possibility that you said that you were interested in this before, and like it made me think about this thing, which I think could be really helpful, or you might want to know about. Would it be okay if I shared it with you? It will only take like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or 2 minutes, whatever. Would that be okay with you? And that then the middle part is, if they've said yes, and we move to the middle part of the burger, and then that would be where you would share it. And then after you've done that, then you get to say, oh, what do you think? Was that helpful? What do you think about what I said? Like, what did it make you think about? Or where should we go next or something. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. I learned it. Yeah, I think that's super nice. I mean, hearing it, it's like, I'm like, wow, like this is so interesting because, like you said, in our settings, we're so far down the spectrum of consensuality that even that conversation wouldn't really happen because it's more discreet and it's more like just the process doesn't yeah, like, I mean, I guess it might happen, but it would be, the dynamic of the people is less like, I'm not there to teach.
Right.
Do you see what I mean? So if that conversation happened, it would be even with less structure, in the sense we might be like, oh, this looks interesting. What do you think? Oh, no, be conversational in all directions of the group. So I'm like, oh, that's so interesting to like that it's a tool. Like for us, this is natural to kind of like have a conversation in that way, I suppose. But I think that what you were saying, if you're working with people who are used to never ever being asked that question around what they learn, they're used to just receive all the time, that just the fact that someone has asked them, would you like me to share this with you, is like, whoa, like, it's going to be a different experience. Then it makes a lot of sense as a really good step in the direction of like a more consensual practice, or like a more consensual environment to be in, with someone that's trying to show them something. I don't know, is that like the kind of response that you were where we were headed?
Yeah, and I'm hoping that people who are listening to this conversation actually notice how much we've already been checking in with each other. Like, we have really been practicing consent actually the whole way, in the way that you just described, around it being more conversational. And even you just did the bottom bun of the burger, right, with me. You checked in. How did it land, Gretchen? Can I speak it back to you? Yes. And then you did. Like, so we've been through the burger several times, just because we as a trio have our own practices around collaboration, is really what I would also say.
Does it work the other way, Gretchen? Like, can someone that you're working with offer you a burger?
It's a good question. I don't know that. How would you answer that, Susanna?
Well, I mean, can they? 100%.
Yeah.
Do they?
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, it doesn't sound the same, but yes, you know what? I have students who say, I'm thinking about something. Can we try this? And like, not ready to do it on their own, but wanting to do it with me. Can we try this different way to do it? So, and then there's always, in a coaching session, the self-reflection piece. It's like, so how did that work? And is this better than it was before? Was that the tweak that you were looking for? And so, yeah, it's just a little more subtle, I think, when it comes from a student, because they're not probably as conscious that what they're doing is bringing me into it. But yeah, I think that's the beauty and what makes a coaching relationship so transformative, is that it can go both ways.
But what you are pointing out is something that's another principle that I teach in my anti-boring world, which is, how do we not just adopt mechanisms for learning and structure learning for our students, but how do we, at the very least, get them to see what we just did, so that they can then learn how to do it for themselves, should they desire. And that is, I would say, a truly highly advanced skill to rise above the curriculum and help students see the curriculum. And the consent burger is part of the curriculum. And in my free gift that I have, GretchenWagner.com/consent, there's a chart that is like, if you're an educator, if you're a parent, I mean, if you're a classroom teacher, a parent, a coach, and a student. And for the student, it's like, adults are not necessarily going to ask you for your consent in the context that we have. But if you know the burger, you can walk through it in your own mind at the very least. You can think through, oh, here's what we're about to learn. Am I willing? well, not really, but maybe 2 out of 10. So there's a little willingness. Okay, I'm going to lean on that. Here, I'll learn the thing. Okay, how was it helpful for me? So you can do it in your own mind at the very least. But even that has, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think that like the really important part of this, and I can feel like the constraint of your work in the mainstream in it, because I feel like in that case, it's like, you don't have to say yes, but it'd be great if you did. It doesn't have to be meaningful for you, but maybe you'll find out it was, it's like, and there is a bias that is trying to still enculturate them to concede to this having been a great idea after all, and I think for that burger to like really be consent based, it needs to be completely okay at the bun for someone to say no.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, cool, let's do something else then. Next, but
in
right?
coaching, that's possible, but in classroom teaching, it's not.
No, but yeah. So then can the young person like mentally do the burger in the classroom and still feel okay to be like, that was a total waste of my time. The two out of 10 was right on. Oh, what's next? Without them being gaslit in a way to kind of like, but it wasn't that bad. It's like, maybe it was that bad. It's like, is possible. But I love what you said about making these tools as transparent, like looking in so that the student also gets that perspective and awareness. It's kind of the same thing that we were saying before around the cracks in the walls or the crack in the door. It's like, you could even have so much fun with that. Like, I love burgers as like a image and a thing. It's like, it's so everyday, isn't it? You just grab a little burger and have a little nom on there. But like, so you could almost be like, oh, I've bought a burger to share with you. Have you bought your burger to share with me? Like, that could be part of the fun of the session, would be like, what's your, so let me tell you, I'll tell you a little tiny intro about my burger, and then let's see if you want to try it. And then the other person who you're coaching or working with could be like, and here's mine, and it's like, that would be playful, and it's all part, I think some of this stuff is about, when you get past the coercion-y bit, you end up in a space of playfulness. You end up in a space like collaboration is playful. It's like, here you go. What do you think? Oh, let's make something cool. Like, what's the point in collaborating if you're not trying to create something together better than what you could do on your own? Do you know what I mean? You're trying to, that's the energy of it. So I think that that's also a very different energy to like learning dressed up as play that isn't really play, but it's to try and sweeten the pill. That's a different thing. But where it is genuine, if you're genuinely interested in what your students might know that you don't, that you are as willing to learn from them as you want them to be to learn from you, if that's genuine. Do you see what I mean? I think in the settings that I work in, you have to go through like 100 ego deaths to be in these spaces, because you have to be willing to be a facilitator in that space who both wants to share and wants to learn genuinely from everyone that is there. You know what I mean? Like, so I have to be like, oh, that I would like to learn about your burger. I do want to hear about it, and that be true, or that I say no when it's not. This is the other thing. Like, imagine if a student bought you a burger and you were like, I actually don't want to hear about it, right? Like, would you be willing to say that? Because this is about authenticity. If you're trying to create like an authentic relating experience and you're like, yeah, yum, when actually you're like, oh, I don't even want to hear about that, you're ruining your own cultural intention, so it really does work both ways. Like this, I think this is so much more about us and how we are and how the work we do on ourselves, to process the impact of having internalized being an educator, you know what I mean? Like we call it deschooling, to come to a place where you can actually like energetically be in a dynamic that is different, to the power over vibe that we're trying to get away. Well, I am at least like wanting to get away from, and I believe you are too. Like, I hear that.
Wanting, and discovering how difficult it is. Like I've been experimenting with working with institutions like this one I'm talking about, and the ways in which I go in with some coercive energy, because time is of the essence and we only have this amount, and I want your investment in me to be worthwhile. And Like I'm dealing with some shame right now around a moment that was accidentally, that had coercive energy in a conversation I had with an administrator there. And so I guess I want to name that, and maybe this is different than your experience, but I'm imagining you, I'm just going to say, like, F it up all the time and have to recover from that, or catch yourself in moments just like I'm sharing. And so, like, consent is not like we rise to this place of perfect virtue and ethics and we stay there. but that it's a noticing, hopefully we don't get too far out of alignment with our value before we catch ourselves and bring us back into alignment. And is that your experience with your own practice?
I think it really depends on where you are in the process of this change. There's a super helpful theory of change model called the two loops theory, which I can send you a link for. I don't know whether we can share it some way, but it shows like the paradigm A that I was talking about before, and then the emergence of the paradigm B, and the gap in between these two. It's like when one system is like peaking and then falling away, and then the new one is like emerging, but it's not like ready yet to kind of like take everyone, you know, on that place. And that within that model, there are lots of different roles of change makers. So there are people that are, they call it hospicing in the dominant system. And I would say that you are both in a way hospicing to the dominant system. It's like, how can we make this less bad? You know, how can we try and help students have like the best experience they possibly can in this environment, which like, frankly, you know, and that's a really important role. And then there are other roles, which is then like building the new, where you are really not involved with the mainstream. You're very much focused on innovating these new cultures, the new spaces that are not affected by these issues in the same way. And all of this ecosystem has to be in place for it to end up in the place that everyone wants it to get to. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't help to have everyone innovating the new and no one hospicing in the, oh, looky, here we go. Nice one. Yeah, it doesn't help for everyone to be doing the same job. You need people spread across everything. So I think that if you are doing what you are doing, which is like more of the hospice work, you can see it there on the diagram, that's it, then you are going to be much more tested in your life. Like you are going to feel more compromised because you are going into environments where no one else cares about this, or like they're just blind to it, or think the main system is good. They don't see even the problem maybe. And in those relationships, like how do you work there? Like you have to figure out like how willing are you to compromise, what parts of yourself do you leave behind, what can you make visible in order to be in that place in a way that feels okay, you know, for you, where you can survive in there and at least do some good, you know. So I think if you're in that experience, then yeah, you are going to much more feel that like, oh, now I feel great. Now I feel great. Whoa, like something's just thrown me out the window again. Oh, come back in. For me, it's not the same, because I made a choice a long time ago to leave. Right? I made a choice that I did not, or I was not the right person to hospice. I was the person that needed to go and build the new. So for me, my way of caring for myself is maintaining the highest possible level of integrity in this as I possibly can, because if I don't do that, I cannot create a community for, you know, we have 70 young people in total that come to us over the days that we're open. We have a staff team, 70, yeah, we have a staff team. All of those people need something to hold on to that is aligned to this way, to have a hope of staying on track. Do you see what I mean? So for me, if I move, like that is a bit catastrophic to the work that I do. I cannot. So I work really hard all the time, and I have done for years, to be very mindful about this. It's almost a spiritual practice, honestly. It's like you have to stay like return to integrity all constantly, even when I'm alone in a room on my own. I'm like checking my own alignment all the time and making really difficult personal decisions around that, because I have to. That's how I feel. That's why I am here, right? Is to be that person doing that thing, and it's not to do the other jobs in that process of change, you know. So what I would say to you is, I cannot say to you, yes, it's true for me too that I find myself in these situations, but the reason for that is not because I'm a better person than you are, it's because I'm in a completely different context.
Yeah.
And if I were in your context, I would probably struggle with that all the time. I would become ill so fast. Honestly, yeah, I would be ill, and it would kick me out through ill health, because that's just because of who I am in this situation. Do you see what I mean? So I have no judgment for that reality for people who are hospicing, that they find that they are in a constant balance between what they feel, what they believe, what they want to be true, and their own integrity versus navigating that environment. Yeah, like that is a whole other ball game, which is not like easier than what I am doing. Do you see what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Susanna, what are you thinking and feeling right now?
Well, one of the things is that I'm one of the questions for me when I listened to the interview, that was, I'm sure you had such a long conversation, you probably just didn't have time to get to it. But I really want to talk about those students who might not be able to access consent-based education. Like, is this a case of those who are privileged are more likely to benefit from a consent-based education? Are there students who this really isn't in the realm of what's realistic for them? Yeah, just that equity piece of, is this for all students?
Is it for all students? Theoretically, yes.
Oh, yes, sorry, yes.
In terms of practical access, no,
Yeah.
not even slightly. I mean, it's not even available. Like, you know, privilege is a very interesting topic and a very important one, right? But, and even within this, even the people with the most privilege, right? The richest, whitest folk, yeah, probably cannot access consent-based education because there is so little of it available. That the way that they will access that, the easiest way to access it is through unschooling, or like a family-based setup of consent-based life, where you as a family group decide that you are going to make that happen for yourself. But even so, like, most home educators are not explicitly and consciously practicing consent-based education. Like, it's, you know, I don't think. So there's no guarantee even that is going to be the case, even if, like, you know, the most privileged of the privileged like try, they won't necessarily be able to, in a way. So it's extremely difficult to access, extremely difficult. I mean, you know, since I started in the UK, there are multiple settings now in the UK that do identify as being consent-based. It's new. I mean, like, without wanting to like I did develop the term personally, like in the UK at least, develop the term consent-based education and the practice and the level of depth of kind of like study into this philosophy or whatever you want to call it. So, like, you know, and what's really great is I get to work with other people and other folk who are inspired, are creating their own settings that have been influenced by this, which is really cool. And I think that generally, if you do the maths, you do end up at consent. So if you're looking at the problem, other folk around the world are coming to the same conclusion. Oh yeah, probably it's because it's not at all consensual. That could be a problem. Do you know what I mean? It's not like, if you stay with the problem long enough, you kind of end up here, I think. But yeah, the opportunities to access it are really tiny, like tiny. But that isn't, like, you know, that for me, that's not a reason to not care about it or be invested, because, like we were saying before, it really boils down to the person. Like, if as a practitioner, as a human, as a parent, as a whatever, you decide to make consent your business, you decide that you care about it, and that you would like yourself to live your life in as consensual a way as you can, and to be in that kind of relationship with other people, then you immediately can start increasing the access by changing your own practice to be more consensual, basically. That's how the change works. You know, it's not like some overarching thing. That's my son. Going, buddy. Yeah, it's not going to be something comes in from the top and it's like, now the whole system will be consent. I mean, that's literally power over. Like, we don't want that way. You know what I mean? So it's like, this only works with the spontaneous consciousness raising of individuals being like, yeah, I don't want to dominate my people anymore. I'd rather be in a consensual, ethical relationship in my work and life. And then like doing the healing work and the reflective work and the, you know, the self-esteem recovery work that you then need to do to then be living and working from that place. You see what I mean? So it's kind of like we have all the power really at our fingertips through our own choices with ourselves and our lives to get started. And we just have to let go of the desire to affect change at a grand scale all at once by getting everyone to do the thing we think they should do. Do you know what I mean?
100%. That was very well said and very clear. And I think it just is like permission for all of us to just think about where is that next step for us to make more space for consent. And everybody can look for a next step. We all have that opportunity right in front of us.
Totally.
We do need to wrap up, and there's one question I really wanted to ask, and you can give a short answer or just say, not short, not going there. But I'm curious where your growth edge is in all of this.
Okay, so my growth edge is definitely connected to my own like neurodivergent limitations, I would say. So it's not in the theory, it's not in the practice. I'm on it, you know, like all of that just feels like good. But what is difficult for me is definitely translating the oral tradition of this work into something that is more shareable and passively accessible, because at the moment pretty much the main way in which people can access like the work that I do anyway is through listening to podcasts like this, listening to stuff on my website, reading the blogging that I've done and the writing that is available, or having like consultancy directly with me, or coming to an in-person workshop, right? Which is like, that's better than nothing. But like, you know, if you're going to work with a whole school, you need resources that can help disseminate the practice across hundreds of people. And that is not easily done. Like, well, I can't do that as an individual, like one-to-one. Do you see what I mean? So my edge is totally around disseminating the practice, like transitioning the practice from what I can say and model, you know, into something that can be easily accessed by other people without me having to be involved, so that they can then feel more able to implement what they want to get on with. So that is my edge, Gretchen. And I'm aware of it. I'm on it. I mean, for me, it's really challenging. Like, I'm a very much in the moment person. So put me under exam conditions or on something like this or live radio and that, I'm like, good for it. I love it. But anything that requires an editing process of any kind, or like, basically that, I find it a lot more difficult to maintain focus and interest, basically. Kind of like ADHD profile, probably. I don't know. You know, it's, So, but the thing is that what I'm doing with that, if you're interested, I don't know, is being in a team. Man, be in a team. Like, I work with great people. I'm co-writing a book right now, only I'm not really writing it. Max, my partner, who is a writer, has got like a book written and everything, you know, so she is like going through all of the recordings that I've ever done and all the writing and like bringing it into a book, you know, like I be in a team. that's my current strategy.
It's a good one.
Be in a team. Yeah.
Oh, well, and there's a lot I could say, and I'm also happy to share outside of this recorded context if it would be helpful for you. I do feel like my specialty, and I think Susanna would agree, is figuring out how to create simplified models for complex ideas that help learners. So if there's any way I can be a support, let me know.
Oh, that's wicked.
Fully endorsed. That is Gretchen's superpower, one of many, but truly a gift.
It is a gift. It's not easy, it's not. But like for you, maybe it is. And that's what's wicked, isn't it? I mean, that's kind of the whole point of this conversation, is that you find out what, I'm not saying don't try and learn the things that you aren't good at, because sometimes I do need to do that. Like, okay, just put on the headphones and like, buckle up and just get on with it. But actually, it's not always the best use of my time, because if there's someone else who is more gifted at that, well, they let them thrive, and then my time can be dedicated to the work which I do really well, which is directly with people. It's like more, the kind of thing you can't document in a written word. So it's about the balance, isn't it, really, between like let people get on with what they are really brilliant at, and if that is in a team, then hopefully you end up with the whole.
Yeah. I'm wondering, and I have a thought where I could do this if this is a good idea for wrap up, whether we just go around and say what we're bringing forward from this conversation out into the rest of our lives. How do you feel about that, Susanna?
I would love that. Yeah. I can even start, because so one, I'm definitely asking my students to share their burger with me. Like that so is going to happen. I want to know what kind of burger it is. I want to know, all the toppings on the burger. But I think for me, because having students be self-directed is the ultimate goal of coaching, and for that to be as explicit as possible. As I said, I think they're doing it, but I haven't done the metacognitive piece where I've like, are you noticing this is what I do? And how about you give it a try and share your burger? So I love that. And oh boy, and there's one other thing that, yes, saying no to my student. I just don't know how I'm ever going to do this, but would be so my learning edge for a student to ask for something and for me to say no. Whoa, but that is genuine consent. If I'm on this journey, and that's my learning edge for sure.
I'm excited by hearing your stories about that, Susanna. Hopefully you'll share in our coaching, in our community calls. Well, I'll say a takeaway, and then I'd love to let you wrap us up, however you wrap us up with what you're bringing forward. But I think for me, there are two things. There's one of the things I really appreciate about how you've shown up to this conversation. I said at the beginning, I want us to tussle. And I really appreciate how you've modeled listening and interacting through your own lens with us. And so like when I shared the consent burger, it's like you were really clear, like, oh yeah, that's not even necessary in our context necessarily because X, Y, and Z. And I think sometimes when experts are sharing, we can go into fawning, right? And to be, oh, what a great thing. Or, oh yeah, I love blah, blah, blah about your model. And so I've really appreciated just you holding your space very spaciously and with curiosity and care and love. And, anyway, so that's wonderful modeling. And then I also really appreciate because you did that, you helped reflect back to me the hospicing piece. And I've been reading the book Hospicing Modernity. Like I've been like, look at that word means something to me now, but given my very specific experience at the school where I'm consulting, it's like, and I'm redesigning my business in preparation for my surgery. And it's a really like, where on that change model am I? And how do I truly own where I am and not pretend to be somewhere I'm not? And if it is hospicing, then let's own that. Let's name it. Let's not make it hidden. And also let's design self-care around the weight of that.
Oh my gosh. Yes. That is so good. That is so good, isn't it? But I love both of your shares. I think for me, I've just really appreciated having this conversation with you both a lot, because one of the sort of disadvantages of like being very much out of the system and in this like innovator type space all the time is that I often don't get to have conversations with folk who are more in that mixed experience or coming up against those challenges on a daily basis. And I really appreciate hearing that, and also having what I hope is the opportunity to show solidarity to you both, that, like what I was saying before around forgiveness doesn't even necessarily feel like the right word, but like understanding that you can have like principles, and still those principles like become like, oh, where have they gone in a certain situation, and I just feel what's the word? I don't know. I feel like convinced of the importance of all the different roles in this, and like the meaningfulness of them, and know that, like, for example, the value and the benefits that you will be bringing to the people that you work with, that I would never get to work with them, you know, and I'm so glad that you are working with them and bringing what you can to them to help them to, you know, have a better experience. Like, I just feel really happy to be part of a whole group of people rather than just over here doing my own thing. Yeah, I don't know, like that feels really good to me. So I'm grateful that you reached out to me and gave me the chance to like spend time with you and get to know a bit more about what you do. Yeah. And I think what would I take away? I think I'm just noticing, like, like my enjoyment of that is encouraging me to think, oh, I wonder if I can do a bit more work with folk like you. Like, how might I be able to do a bit more work with people that are still in the working more with folk in the mainstream? Because I do that occasionally. Like, if someone signs up to my course who's a mainstream teacher or who's doing supply work in mainstream system, for example, then it does happen. But I haven't really been offering something specifically for that group, partly because of like wanting to like stay at this end of the spectrum. But I think it would actually be good. Yeah, I think I'd enjoy it. So thank you for letting me notice that in myself.
You're so welcome. Yeah, and feel free to use us too. Like, if you already bounce ideas off of, or if you have questions. It's funny because I feel like we're outliers, but then you're even more of an outlier. So it's fun to hear you talk about us as being part of the mainstream, because I feel like I've got one foot in the mainstream and one foot out, and I'm like straddling wider and wider.
Yeah, and it felt great for me to hear from someone who's in that very niche area that is happening. It is so hopeful to me to hear that does exist and that there is a model of it. And I know it's small, but it just means it is possible. It is something that can be done. And so that's very hopeful for me.
Yeah, definitely. And I do want to say to you both that in like when I'm doing if I do like a 1 hour call, I hold that whole hour in our frame of consent-based practice, the same as we have with the setting. The setting, it's like a day. And so I just condense it. And the practices we use at the top and the bottom, I always use like even in an hour. So I think just want to encourage you both that you can create really good consent-based space, like in small portions of time or in contained little pockets, and to play with that. Because you know, do you know what I mean? Like it's possible to do it in these like little ways that are like all over the place, not just in like one community that's doing it. Yeah.
Well, and if one would like to learn what you mean, because I'm like, we're out of time and now we don't have time to ask what that looks like.
Well, I was going to say, I bet you it looks kind of anti-boring-ish. I bet you there's lots of playfulness in there.
It needs to be more hamburgers on my side.
Now, I've learned they're not hamburgers. They are burgers, because the vegans and vegetarians amongst us took some issue. And so these are whatever form of protein you are nourishing your mind, body, spirit with.
Yes. Yeah. Mine would be a naked burger because I can't have wheat.
Well, there you go.
Mine is naked as well. I cannot have a bun, but you know, we'll work around this somehow.
Up lettuce, bottom lettuce, you know.
We're having a lettuce burger.
Oh. Well, I think we can consider ourselves concluded now that we were laughing about burger buns. But thanks so much for your time. I know your son was looking for you, so I don't want us to have to keep you longer. But
oh, well, thank you so much for having me. And I really hope your surgery goes well, Gretchen.
Thank you.
Yeah, best wishes for it.
Me too.
So nice to meet you and chat with you. And I love how comfortable the conversation was. It was great, Sophie.
Oh, yay. It's really nice to meet you too, Susanna. And like, keep it up, folks. Yay.
All of us.
Keep going. Woo, woo, woo. That's it. All right.
welcome to the Gretchen and Susanna after party. Susanna, you have to say something when you dance so that it actually gets you.
Oh yes, because we're on. It's the after party.
There we go. Although we don't have the little green lights around us, so I don't know. So we just had this wonderful conversation with Sophie, and then we were talking about how we wanted to follow it up, but we were doing that outside of the recording. And then we realized, we just need to be recording. So you get to see us in process. So Susanna, are you able to summarize some part of what we shared just now so that we can catch people up?
Yes. So we started to have a conversation. I was worried because I listened to the podcast that maybe there was quite a lot of information about what consent-based education is that we didn't really go into in this conversation because we just started deep and it got juicy and we just went with it. And so if that's the case, and you're feeling a little bit lost listening to us, it might be helpful to go back to that podcast because maybe that context might be helpful to you to follow this conversation. But just a thought.
Yeah, and the podcast that Susanna's talking about is the Rethink Education podcast. We'll link to it below in the description. So if you want to really understand what is her context like, and even what is the history of schooling in general, such that we are talking about schooling as coercive and violent and having nefarious intentions, which it is true that through one lens, the history of education really was designed to support colonialization, to support moving people out of their authentic selves into some quote unquote better way of being that a select group of privileged and powerful people decided was the most important. Did I say that well?
You did. And and coerced out of their way of being because it was demeaned or decided that it was less than in some way. And so that power structure got set up. And then it became the only way to have people do what was necessary was with punitive measures of some kind. So all those underpinnings exist as like foundational in our school system. That was how it was set up initially and has not shifted, like marginally shifted throughout all of history.
Right. So that when people use school as a verb, like you just schooled me, it has negative connotations, right? We rarely use that in a positive way. Sometimes we do, you just schooled me, like, oh, I'm grateful for that information. But still, it's like information coming at you in a way that kind of ignores who the receiver is. Anyway, that podcast is linked below if you want a little bit more history about that or Sophie and her work. And it was a great conversation. Is there anything else you wish we had said or done or directions we had gone that we didn't have time to go to, Susanna?
I think we didn't have as much opportunity to have, especially as coaches, to talk about that role that parents play in our wonderful mutual relationship between coach, student, and family, and parents paying for a service, and what is the role of consent and where are the boundaries? I guess, a conversation around boundaries when that's the dynamic that's set up. I think it's an interesting conversation to have.
It is. And we talk about it a lot in our anti-boring community. So we have it there, but that's an interesting thing to flag for the future. I love this. Things we didn't say. We're not going to talk about them now. We're just going to talk about.
I don't have an answer. I don't know. How do we get more consent in that dynamic between parents? I don't know.
Yeah, and in the triangle between parent, student, coach, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the other thing we didn't do was we didn't name that we're three white women talking about this topic. And so there are definitely different cultural voices that were not present, different racial voices. I'm assuming, although we don't know this about her, we're also straight white women. And I think that, maybe even the idea of consent isn't necessarily brand new. There are other cultures and ways of being that have it practiced much more fluently. And it is specifically our Western model that actually needs to think it through differently, because we've done so much violence to the world through non-consensual practices.
Yeah, I feel like we really did have an opportunity to reflect on how this could, how each of us, no matter what role we're in, how we can, I think there's lots of ideas in there about how we could introduce more consent into our relationships, not just in our working relationships, but even with just the people in our lives.
Yes.
And why we might want to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think about this all the time related to dating. You know, and I'm a 49, almost 50-year-old woman consistently dating and figuring out how to, and I'm not just talking about sex, like literally in the first messages online, you know, how do I not just force my way of being into the dynamic and figure out, like, how do we discover collaboration? How do we start negotiating needs around our process right away? Some guys want to just get out of text right away. That doesn't work for me, but how to, anyway, it's a, and I think that's what we learned through this conversation too, was we have to practice inside ourselves if we are going to actually be in integrity and right relationship with students as well. And that's a key tenet of the anti-boring approach, is our educators actually taking the time to fully try on the tools, while, it doesn't have to be before, but at least while you are teaching them to others.
Yeah. And are we using all of those tools in a like continuing to push ourselves while using those tools to increase the humanness and the way that we deliver them, so that we continue to provide more and more space for students?
Yeah. Yeah. And we're practicing that as coaches. And it's just always interesting to me how classroom teachers can practice that more themselves, given the greater limitations they have in the structure of being inside schools. And if there are any teachers out there listening and have some thoughts about this, let us know. Email me at Gretchen@GretchenWegner.com and say, hey, I would love to talk to you and Susanna about how this plays out inside the classroom. We would be so excited to do that, preferably on camera on YouTube, but we could even have the conversation off camera too.
And did you want to say anything? The only other thing that we might have wanted to add to the after party was a little bit of a conversation around students being, it was at the beginning of our conversation with Sophie, just around that being passive and active in consent. Was that anything you wanted to add to this, or we had enough say about that?
I think we've had enough say about it, but I, like you, I mean, I'm not working with a lot of student clients right now. But I, like you, I'm interested. Oh, I just love it when I catch myself, or in this case, when somebody else catches me in not fully integrating all of my beliefs, tools, and values. So the consent burger is one context that I haven't made overt to students, and I haven't asked the coaches who are in our community to consider making that structure overt. I did it in the handout that you can get at GretchenWegner.com/consent. But I haven't fully integrated that yet. And I love that she named that. So I really am interested in how do we as educators take breaks in our time with students to say, did you notice what just happened? It's pretty cool what just happened. What did you see? What did I do? What did you do? What does that mean? And to have moments like that, even if it's not cool. Ooh, did you notice what happened? I just, the consent burger? Was I inside the consent burger right now? I was not, or letting students tell that to us. Both of those are possible when we learn how to take these meta breaks to notice what's happening.
Love the meta break.
Maybe that's what it needs to be called. I don't have a name for that yet. Meta break.
We call them, oh no, that's way too much. Well, they're in the Flexible Mindsets book, they're called metacognitive insights, but that's way too big. That's like the formal term from them, but they're like defined as those like uh-oh moments where you realize there's something incongruous and that you're like, oh, uh-oh.
But it doesn't
Something-
have to be incongruent, right?
No, absolutely
Yeah.
not. No. That's why, yes.
Yeah,
We're gonna
you're right.
go
Too
with
long. Meta break.
meta break.
Okay, we could go on and on and on and on and on, but if you stuck it out, dear listeners, to the end of this video, we are so appreciative of you. And that even that was helpful to watch until the end, but we forgot to say earlier to like and subscribe and do all the things. And it really makes such a difference. So thank you in advance. I catch myself, meta break moment, I catch myself often not doing that on YouTube. And I'm trying these days because I ask y'all to do it. So when I'm watching videos, I better damn well do it too. So I'm trying.